Rolex spends more money fighting counterfeit watches than most Swiss watch brands spend on total annual marketing. The legal team, the investigators, the customs enforcement partnerships, and the authentication technology make up a budget line that runs into tens of millions of dollars annually and has for over a decade. The counterfeit market is larger today than when that spending started. That is not a coincidence. That is what losing looks like when you refuse to admit you are losing. Because here is what nobody in the watch industry wants to say out loud. The factories that Rolex has been hunting for years, the ones getting raided, getting sued, and shut down by customs agents across 3 continents, have gotten better at making watches because of the pressure. Every authentication feature Rolex introduced to expose fakes became a homework assignment. Every legal action that forced an operation to close created 5 smaller ones that were harder to find. And somewhere along the way, the gap between what a genuine Rolex is and what the best Chinese factories can produce got narrow enough that experienced collectors, people who have handled hundreds of these watches, are having moments of genuine uncertainty. This video will show exactly how it happened. Subscribe to the channel if this kind of content is useful. It genuinely helps keep this going. To understand where things stand in 2026, it helps to understand where they started. The counterfeit watch industry is not new. Fake Rolexes have existed almost as long as Rolex has. For most of the 20th century, the quality gap between a genuine Rolex and a counterfeit was immediately obvious to anyone who picked one up. The weight was wrong. The finishing was wrong. The movement visible through an exhibition caseback, when fakes bothered to include one at all, was obviously incorrect. A reasonably attentive person could identify a fake in 30 seconds. The word counterfeit matters here. That era ended gradually, and then all at once. The manufacturing infrastructure that built China into the world's dominant producer of consumer electronics, precision machinery, and industrial components did not stay confined to those categories. The same CNC machining centers, the same metallurgical capabilities, the same supply chains for specialty materials that enabled Chinese factories to produce components to aerospace tolerances found their way into watch production. Not immediately, not uniformly, but directionally and irreversibly. Infrastructure is the key change. The first generation of what the collector community began calling superclones appeared in meaningful numbers around 2015 and 2016. These were not the obvious tourist market fakes that customs agents had been seizing for years. They were watches built with actual attention to the details that authenticators checked: correct case dimensions, correct bracelet construction, correct dial printing, movements that mimicked the visual profile of the genuine article closely enough that a casual inspection missed nothing obviously wrong. The response from Rolex and from the authentication community was to go deeper. If the surface details were now convincing, the internal details would reveal the difference. Movement inspection became the standard. A genuine Rolex caliber 3235 has specific architecture, specific finishing, specific component geometry that a fake movement cannot replicate convincingly. The rotor engraving, the bridge finishing, the level of anglage on the movement components, these became the authentication checkpoints that separated genuine from fake at the expert level. The factories in Shenzhen responded by improving the movements. This is the dynamic that defines the current situation and explains why Rolex's enforcement efforts face structural limits that money and legal action cannot fully overcome. Every time the authentication community identified the specific details that exposed counterfeits, the counterfeit manufacturers updated their production to address those details. It is not a static target. It is an arms race, where the defenders have to be right about every detail every time, and the counterfeiters only have to be right about the details that actually get checked. By 2022 and into 2023, the highest tier of Chinese counterfeit Rolex production had reached a level of quality that the watch community had no consensus framework for describing. The term superclone became inadequate because it implied a category, and the category had fragmented. There were superclones, and then there were what some authenticators privately called representation pieces. These were watches where the quality of materials and construction was genuinely high, where the movement, while not a genuine Rolex caliber, was a purpose-built clone movement, with significantly better finishing and reliability than earlier generations, and where the visual and tactile experience of handling the watch was close enough to the genuine article that experienced collectors reported being briefly uncertain on first inspection. The Rolex Daytona was the reference that crystallized this problem most publicly. The steel Daytona's gray market premium, driven by genuine scarcity and sustained demand, made it the most financially motivated target for counterfeit production. If a factory could produce a watch that passed casual and semi-experienced inspection for 1/10 of the genuine gray market price, the margin on that fraud was extraordinary. The investment in quality that the top Chinese factories applied to the Daytona clone specifically reflected that financial motivation. What Rolex has done in response covers several distinct tracks, and understanding each one separately explains both what has worked and what has not. On the legal enforcement track, Rolex has been aggressive and largely effective within its limits. The brand maintains a dedicated anti-counterfeiting team that works with customs agencies across Europe, North America, and increasingly in Southeast Asian transit hubs. Seizures are real and substantial, hundreds of thousands of counterfeit watches annually across shipments ranging from individual parcels to container-scale operations. Legal actions against specific manufacturers and distributors have led to convictions, factory closures, and in some cases, meaningful prison sentences in jurisdictions where counterfeiting is prosecuted seriously. The structural limit of this approach is that it operates on a supply chain that is extraordinarily distributed and resilient. A factory that gets raided and closed is replaced by several smaller operations that do not represent the same concentration of risk. The supply chain for counterfeit components, cases, bracelets, dials, and movements has become so fragmented that the finished watch may be assembled from components produced in 6 different locations by parties who have no direct relationship with each other. Seizing the assembler does not affect the component suppliers. Seizing a shipment does not affect the factory. The legal enforcement track wins specific battles consistently, and it does not change the overall production landscape. Subscribe to support the channel if this analysis is useful. On the authentication technology track, Rolex has made investments that have changed what genuine authentication looks like, and also created new problems that were not anticipated when those investments were made. The laser-engraved crown at 6 o'clock on the sapphire crystal, the rehaut engraving with serial number, the micro-etching and specific surface finishing characteristics on genuine components were introduced in part as anti-counterfeiting measures. They work in the specific sense that counterfeiting them accurately is expensive and technically demanding. They do not work in the broader sense because the highest tier counterfeit operations have reverse engineered and replicated each of these features to a degree that is not immediately obvious under casual inspection. The laser crown at 6 o'clock on a genuine Rolex from the current production era is essentially invisible to the naked eye and visible under magnification. On the highest tier fakes, there is also a crown at 6 o'clock under magnification. It is not identical. The depth, the clarity, and the specific geometry differ from the genuine in ways that a trained eye with proper lighting can identify. But it exists. The counterfeit manufacturers understood that the absence of the feature was an immediate authentication failure, and they addressed the absence. That is the pattern that repeats across every authentication feature Rolex has introduced. The most interesting and consequential development on the authentication technology side is Rolex's partnership with blockchain-based authentication registries and the integration of NFC components into its packaging and documentation. A genuine Rolex sold from 2021 onward comes with a green seal on a green card that contains an NFC chip. That chip, when scanned by an authorized app, returns a verification of the watch's authenticity tied to the specific serial number. The system is designed to create an authentication layer that cannot be replicated by copying the physical watch alone, because the authentication now exists in a database that the counterfeiter cannot access. This is genuinely clever, and it has changed the dynamic for watches sold through authorized channels with original, unbroken documentation. For the pre-owned and gray market, where the vast majority of Rolex transactions occur, and where counterfeit risk is highest, it changes almost nothing. A watch sold on the gray market without original sealed documentation does not carry the NFC verification. The authentication reverts to physical inspection of the watch itself, which is exactly the domain where the counterfeit quality gap has been narrowing. There is a separate problem that Rolex's authentication technology investments have created, and it is one that the brand does not discuss publicly. The existence of sophisticated authentication systems that require specific equipment and expertise has created a two-tier authentication landscape. Buyers who understand the system, have access to the tools, and know where to find qualified authenticators can navigate it. Buyers who rely on general market confidence, who purchase a watch from a secondhand dealer or at auction without independent authentication, are increasingly dependent on an authentication chain that has more failure points than it did a decade ago. The auction houses have responded to this by increasing their authentication requirements and investing in in-house expertise. The major platforms, Chrono24, Bob's Watches, and similar, have introduced authentication programs with varying levels of rigor. The peer-to-peer market, including social media sales and private transactions, has no systematic authentication infrastructure at all. That last category is where buyers are most exposed, and it is the largest and fastest growing segment of the secondary market. Now, what the Chinese counterfeit industry actually looks like in 2026 is more nuanced than the simple narrative of fakes versus genuine. The counterfeit market is not a single thing. It is a spectrum that ranges from obvious tourist market pieces sold for $20 on street corners through mid-tier watches sold online at prices that signal this is probably not genuine, but it looks good, up to the top-tier production that is explicitly marketed to buyers who understand what they are buying and are making a deliberate choice to purchase a non-genuine watch that they know is not genuine. That last category creates the most complicated legal and ethical questions and the most complicated authentication challenges. A buyer who purchases a watch knowing it is not genuine for personal use, in a jurisdiction where personal importation of a single counterfeit item is a civil matter rather than a criminal one, occupies a different legal position than a seller moving counterfeit watches at genuine prices to buyers who believe they are purchasing the real thing. Rolex's legal enforcement efforts are correctly focused on the latter. The former is practically unenforceable at scale. The manufacturers producing for the top tier of the informed buyer counterfeit market have, in some ways, developed an interesting product, a watch with genuinely better component quality than anything available in the legitimate market at the same price, paired with aesthetics that replicate a specific desirable reference, sold to a buyer who has made an explicit choice about what they are purchasing. The ethical dimension of that transaction is a legitimate debate. The legal dimension depends on jurisdiction. The authentication dimension, where it bleeds into fraud when one of those watches ends up in the genuine market, is where the serious damage occurs. The damage to the genuine market from top-tier counterfeits does not primarily come from people buying fakes thinking they are real at street level. It comes from those watches entering the secondary market through chains that obscure their origin, a fake sold as genuine to a secondhand dealer who performs an inadequate authentication and resells it with a certificate into the gray market where it is sold again and eventually purchased by someone who paid genuine market price for a watch that is not genuine. That chain is real. It is documented in collector forums and in legal cases, and it is the mechanism through which the quality improvement in counterfeits translates into direct financial harm to legitimate market participants. The specific Rolex references most heavily counterfeited at the top tier in 2026 reflect the premium structure of the genuine market. The steel Daytona remains the primary target because it commands the highest gray market premium of any steel Rolex reference. The GMT Master 2, Batman and Pepsi variants follow because their premiums and cultural profile make them high-value fraud targets. The Submariner date in steel is the highest volume target because it is the highest volume Rolex reference overall. What genuine Rolex has going for it in this fight, beyond the legal and technology tracks, is something less tangible and more durable. The genuine market for authentic Rolexes is supported by a collector community that has developed extraordinary authentication expertise, that shares information freely across forums and authentication groups, and that has a genuine financial and cultural motivation to maintain the integrity of the market. The number of people who can sit across a table from a watch and identify a superclone through a combination of physical inspection, movement behavior, and reference knowledge has grown significantly as the counterfeit threat has grown. That growing expertise is a form of distributed authentication. The community has, in some ways, become Rolex's most effective authentication partner, not because Rolex organized it that way, but because the community's own interests align with accurate market information. That community knowledge is also available publicly. The authentication guides that describe exactly what to check on a genuine Daytona movement are published in forum threads. The specific tolerances for the rehout engraving, the correct behavior of the date magnification, and the specific feel of the oyster bracelet clasp mechanism are all documented and accessible. Buyers who do the work before purchasing have more protection than they have ever had. Buyers who rely on the seller's representation alone have less protection than they think. Where does this leave the overall picture in 2026? Rolex's enforcement efforts have kept the counterfeit problem from being worse than it is. The seizures, the legal actions, and the technology investments have created friction for counterfeit distribution that meaningfully raises the cost and risk of the enterprise. Without that friction, the current counterfeit quality would be accessible at even lower cost and through more mainstream channels. Enforcement has contained some of the distribution channels, but it is not a complete solution. At the same time, enforcement has not and cannot reverse the fundamental quality improvement that has occurred in the top tier of Chinese counterfeit production. The manufacturing capability that enabled that improvement is broadly distributed, economically motivated by margins that dwarf the enforcement risk, and operating in a legal environment in China that does not treat watch counterfeiting with the same severity that Western intellectual property frameworks do. This is a problem of quality and scale. The practical implications for buyers are specific. A Rolex purchased from an authorized dealer with original sealed documentation is protected by the authentication system Rolex has built. A Rolex purchased from the gray market or the second-hand market without original sealed documentation requires independent authentication from a qualified source before any significant transaction is concluded. The risk of purchasing a top-tier counterfeit at genuine market prices is real, it is not going away, and the only reliable defense is the combination of qualified authentication and the kind of provenance documentation that traces the watch's ownership history back to a verifiable, authorized purchase. The war that Rolex declared against Chinese counterfeits has achieved something important. It has contained the problem within limits that allow the genuine market to function. It has not won in the sense of eliminating the threat or reversing the quality trajectory. The factories in Shenzhen did not stop when the enforcement pressure increased. They adapted, improved, and produced a better product in response to every authentication advance. That is not a comfortable outcome for a brand that has built its entire identity on precision, authenticity, and the idea that a Rolex is a specific thing with specific meaning. It is, however, the honest description of where things stand. Buyers who understand this dynamic are the ones who can navigate the current market safely. Buyers who assume the Rolex name and the authentication system in place provide complete protection without doing the specific work of verifying provenance and getting qualified authentication on any secondhand purchase are the ones the top-tier counterfeit market is built to reach. The war is ongoing. The outcome on the ground is contested. Anyone spending genuine market money on a genuine Rolex in 2026 needs to understand both of those things before the transaction closes. If this kind of honest breakdown of the watch market and industry is useful, subscribing to the channel is the best way to support it. More content like this takes real time to put together, and the support is genuinely appreciated.